After my husband's funeral, my son drove me to a remote road and said, "This is where you get off." I was still wearing my black dress from the service, still had the funeral program folded in my purse, still had dirt under my fingernails from throwing that handful of earth onto Robert's casket 3 hours earlier. David pulled over on County Road 47, about 15 miles from town, and told me to get out. He said I had been a burden long enough, and now that Dad was gone, he wasn't going to pretend to care about me anymore. He drove away while I stood there in my funeral shoes, watching his taillights disappear into the darkness, leaving me alone on a road where nobody would think to look for me. My name is Vivian Crenshaw, and for 42 years I worked as a bookkeeper for Henderson Construction Company. Every morning, I would drive my blue Honda Civic to the office on Industrial Boulevard, where I managed payroll for 63 employees, tracked job expenses, and reconciled accounts with 3 different banks. The work required precision and patience, qualities that served me well both in the office and at home. Robert and I had been married for 47 years when the cancer took him. We lived in the same house on Elm Street that we bought in 1978, a modest 2-bedroom ranch with a vegetable garden in the back and a front porch where we used to sit in the evenings. After Robert retired from the railroad, we fell into comfortable routines: grocery shopping on Tuesdays, church on Sundays, visits to the doctor that became more frequent as we got older. I retired at 65, 3 years before Robert got sick. We had saved carefully throughout our marriage, living below our means and investing in conservative funds that grew steadily over the decades. Our financial advisor, Mr. Patterson, told us we had done well for ourselves, enough to live comfortably without depending on anyone else. The house was paid off, we had good health insurance, and our retirement accounts were substantial enough to handle unexpected medical expenses. David was our only child, born when I was 24 and Robert was 26. We had wanted more children, but it never happened. Maybe that made us focus too much attention on David, or maybe we were just naive about how children turn out despite your best efforts. He had been a difficult teenager, skipping school, getting arrested for vandalism, dropping out of college after one semester that we paid for. At 39, David worked sporadically in construction and lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of town with his girlfriend Melissa and her 2 children from a previous relationship. He drove an old pickup truck that broke down regularly and borrowed money from us at least once a month for rent, utilities, or car repairs that he never quite managed to pay back. If this story hits home, make sure you're subscribed. We tell these for a reason. The problem started when Robert was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. David didn't visit the hospital during the 3 weeks Robert was there, even though I called him every day with updates. He said hospitals made him uncomfortable, and he would come see his father when he got home. But when Robert came home on hospice care, David showed up exactly twice in 6 weeks. Both times he asked if we needed anything from the store, then left within 20 minutes. I was taking care of Robert around the clock, managing his medications, helping him to the bathroom, cooking soft foods he could keep down. The hospice nurse, Mrs. Garcia, came 3 times a week, but the rest of the time it was just me and Robert in that quiet house, watching him fade away a little more each day. 2 weeks before Robert died, David came over and asked to speak with me privately. He said he was worried about my future, about what would happen to me after Dad was gone. He suggested that maybe I should consider moving to Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility across town. He said I was getting older, and it might be safer for me to have people around to help with things. I told him I was only 68 years old and perfectly capable of living independently. I reminded him that I had been managing our household finances, our insurance, and Robert's medical care without any help from anyone. David said he was just thinking ahead, that it was important to make these decisions before they became emergencies. What he didn't say, but what I understood clearly, was that he was already thinking about what would happen to the house and our savings after I was gone. He had been looking at me like I was an obstacle standing between him and an inheritance he felt he deserved. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in October. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, and I sat with him for an hour before I called the hospice nurse. David arrived 20 minutes after the funeral home took Robert's body. He hugged me briefly and said he was sorry for my loss, but his eyes were already scanning the living room, taking inventory of what might be valuable. The funeral was small but dignified. Robert's railroad friends came, along with people from our church and my former coworkers. David gave a short speech about what a good father Robert had been, though he stumbled over the words like he was reading from a script. After the service, he offered to drive me home since I had ridden to the cemetery with Mrs. Peterson from church. I should have known something was wrong when David took a different route home from the cemetery. Instead of turning toward town, he drove out past the grain elevators and the abandoned gas station, heading toward the county roads that led to nowhere in particular. I asked him where we were going, and he said he wanted to talk to me about something important, somewhere we wouldn't be interrupted. He pulled over on County Road 47, a narrow strip of asphalt that ran between cornfields for miles without a single house or business in sight. The sun was setting behind the trees, and I could see nothing but empty fields in every direction. David turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Then he told me the truth about what he had been planning. He said he couldn't afford to take care of me, and he wasn't going to pretend that he wanted to. He said I had always been demanding and critical, that I had made his childhood miserable with my rules and expectations. He said Robert was the only reason he had maintained any relationship with me at all, and now that buffer was gone. I sat there in the passenger seat, still wearing my funeral dress, listening to my son tell me that I was worthless to him. He said I had savings and Social Security, so I could figure out how to survive on my own. He said Melissa's kids needed things, and he couldn't waste time or money on someone who had never appreciated what he had done for her anyway. When I didn't respond immediately, he got out of the truck and walked around to my side. He opened the passenger door and told me to get out. I asked him if he was serious, if he was really planning to leave his 68-year-old mother on a deserted road on the day of his father's funeral. He said I had been taking care of myself my whole life, so this shouldn't be any different. I got out of the truck because I didn't have a choice. David got back in, rolled down the window, and told me there was a gas station about 5 miles back toward town. He said I could call someone from there if I needed help. Then he drove away, leaving me standing in the gravel beside the road, watching his taillights disappear into the darkness. The temperature was dropping, and I didn't have a coat. My funeral shoes weren't made for walking on gravel roads. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened, then started walking back toward the distant glow of town. It took me 2 hours to walk to the gas station. A trucker named Earl stopped and gave me a ride the last mile after he saw me limping along the shoulder of the highway. He didn't ask too many questions, just said it wasn't safe for a lady to be walking alone at night. He waited while I called Mrs. Peterson from the payphone outside the station, and she drove out to pick me up. I didn't tell Mrs. Peterson what had really happened. I said David had car trouble and had to leave me at the gas station while he got help. She clucked sympathetically about how stressful the day had been and drove me home to my empty house on Elm Street. After she left, I sat in Robert's recliner in the living room, staring at the sympathy cards lined up on the mantel, trying to make sense of what my son had done to me. The hurt was overwhelming at first. David was the child I had carried for 9 months, the baby I had nursed through colic and fevers, the toddler I had taught to walk and tie his shoes. I had saved money for his college education, paid for his car insurance until he was 25, bailed him out of jail twice, and loaned him thousands of dollars over the years that he had never repaid. But underneath the hurt, something else was building. A cold, clear anger that seemed to sharpen my thinking instead of clouding it. David had abandoned me on the worst day of my life because he saw me as a burden. He had calculated that I was more valuable to him dead than alive, and he was willing to speed up that process by leaving me on a deserted road in the dark. I spent the rest of that night going through our financial records. Robert and I had been careful savers, and our estate was worth more than David probably realized. The house was valued at $180,000. Our retirement accounts totaled nearly $400,000. There was a life insurance policy on Robert worth $50,000 and another policy on me worth the same amount. David was the sole beneficiary on everything. When I died, he would inherit close to $700,000, enough to change his life completely. No wonder he was eager to get me out of the way. But David had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed I would be too weak and too lonely to do anything about what he had done. He had underestimated the woman who had managed payroll for 63 employees, who had navigated insurance companies and Medicare bureaucrats, who had spent 6 weeks caring for a dying husband without breaking down. The next morning, I called my attorney, James Mitchell, and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Mr. Mitchell had handled our wills and estate planning for 15 years, and he knew our family situation well. I told him I wanted to make some changes to my will in light of Robert's death and my changing circumstances. I didn't tell him about being abandoned on County Road 47. Instead, I said that recent events had made me reconsider how I wanted my estate distributed. I explained that I was concerned about David's financial stability and his ability to manage a large inheritance responsibly. Mr. Mitchell nodded sympathetically and said many parents struggled with similar concerns. Over the next few weeks, I began restructuring my entire estate. I established a charitable trust that would donate most of my assets to local organizations after my death: the food bank, the animal shelter, the scholarship fund at the community college. I changed the beneficiaries on my retirement accounts and life insurance policies. I updated my will to leave David exactly $1,000, enough to show that the omission wasn't an oversight. But that wasn't enough. David needed to understand the consequences of his actions while I was still alive to see his reaction. I started by cutting off all financial support. When he called asking for money to fix his truck, I told him I was on a fixed income now and couldn't afford to help. When Melissa called asking if I could help with the electricity bill, I said I was sorry, but my own expenses were too high. David seemed puzzled by my refusal to help, but not worried. He probably assumed I was grieving and would come around eventually. Then I began gathering evidence. I drove back to County Road 47 and took photographs of the location where he had abandoned me. I documented the exact mileage from the cemetery to that spot, and from there to the gas station where I had walked. I wrote down every detail I could remember about that night: the time, the temperature, the things David had said to me. The tricky part was figuring out how to make David understand what he had done without revealing my plans too early. I needed him to feel secure in his assumption that he would inherit everything, right up until the moment he discovered the truth. 6 months after Robert's funeral, David called to tell me that Melissa was pregnant. He said they were excited about the baby but worried about money. He suggested that maybe it was time for me to think seriously about moving to Sunset Manor, since the house was getting too big for me to manage alone. He said they could help me find a good realtor, and the proceeds from selling the house could pay for my care at the facility. I told him that sounded like a reasonable plan and that I would think about it seriously. David seemed pleased and said he was glad I was being practical about my situation. He said he would start looking into available units at Sunset Manor and get me some brochures to review. That's when I knew it was time to act. I called Mr. Mitchell and told him I was ready to execute the final phase of my estate planning. He had prepared all the documents, and we scheduled a formal signing for the following Wednesday. I also asked him to prepare a detailed summary of all the changes I had made, formatted like the estate planning documents his office usually provided to clients. On Tuesday, I invited David and Melissa over for dinner. I cooked his favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans from my garden. We sat around the kitchen table where he had eaten thousands of meals as a child, talking about the baby and their plans for the future. After dinner, I brought out the folder that Mr. Mitchell had prepared. I told David that I had been thinking about what he had said about planning ahead, and I wanted him to see the arrangements I had made for my estate. I said I thought it was important for him to understand what would happen when I was gone, so he could plan accordingly. David opened the folder eagerly, expecting to see documents that would make him wealthy. Instead, he found page after page detailing how my assets would be distributed to charitable organizations. The house would go to Habitat for Humanity. My retirement accounts would fund scholarships for students from low-income families. My life insurance would benefit the hospice program that had cared for Robert. I watched his face change as he read through the documents. Confusion, then disbelief, then anger. He looked up at me and asked what this was supposed to mean. I told him it meant exactly what it said. When I died, almost everything I owned would go to people who needed it more than he did. Melissa started asking questions about why I would do such a thing, whether I was angry about something, if there was a way to change my mind. But David just sat there staring at the papers, probably calculating how much money he had just lost. Then I told him the real reason for my decision. I reminded him about the night after his father's funeral, when he had driven me to County Road 47 and abandoned me in the dark. I described the tower walk to the gas station, the fear I had felt standing alone on that deserted road, the realization that my own son had been willing to put my life at risk because he saw me as an inconvenience. I told him that his actions that night had shown me exactly what kind of person he was and what kind of son I had raised. I said I couldn't leave my life savings to someone who had demonstrated such cruelty toward the woman who had given him everything. David tried to deny it at first, then to justify it, then to apologize. But I was done listening to his excuses. I told them they needed to leave my house and not come back unless they were invited. The phone calls started the next day. David, Melissa, even Melissa's mother called to beg me to reconsider. They offered to help me around the house, to visit more often, to include me in their family activities. David swore that abandoning me on County Road 47 had been a moment of grief-induced madness, that he regretted it every day and would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. But their desperation only confirmed that I had made the right decision. They weren't sorry for how they had treated me, they were sorry for the consequences of being caught. I changed my phone number and had a security system installed in my house. I didn't want to spend my remaining years dealing with David's manipulation and false apologies. The peace that settled over my life after cutting him off was something I hadn't experienced in decades. 3 months later, I received a letter from David's attorney threatening to contest my will on the grounds of diminished capacity. Mr. Mitchell assured me that such challenges were rarely successful, especially when the estate planning had been done carefully over an extended period of time. We had documentation of my mental competency and clear evidence that my decisions were rational and considered. The legal threat backfired in a way David hadn't anticipated. It prompted me to write a detailed letter explaining my reasons for disinheriting him, which Mr. Mitchell included with my will as supporting documentation. The letter described exactly what had happened on County Road 47 and explained why I could not trust my legacy to someone who had shown such callous disregard for my welfare. I also decided to accelerate some of my charitable giving while I was still alive. I sold the house and moved to a comfortable senior apartment complex across town. I donated half the proceeds to the local food bank and used the rest to set up an immediate scholarship fund for students whose parents couldn't afford college tuition. It's been 2 years since that night on County Road 47, and I haven't spoken to David since the dinner when I showed him the estate documents. I heard through Mrs. Peterson that Melissa left him when she realized he wouldn't be inheriting any money, taking her children and the new baby with her. Apparently, she had been counting on my death to solve their financial problems, just like David was. I live comfortably in my apartment at Riverside Senior Community. I have friends here, activities I enjoy, and the satisfaction of knowing that my money will do genuine good in the world after I'm gone. The scholarship fund has already helped 12 students start college, and the food bank sends me regular updates about the families they're able to serve with my donations. Sometimes I drive past County Road 47 on my way to visit Robert's grave. I remember standing there in my funeral dress, abandoned and afraid, not knowing how I was going to get home. But I also remember the moment when hurt transformed into determination, when I stopped being a victim and started being someone who fights back. David thought he could discard me like an inconvenient burden, gambling that I would be too weak and too lonely to resist. He calculated that my love for him would overcome any resentment about how he treated me. He was wrong on both counts. The best revenge isn't getting even with someone who hurt you. Sometimes it's making sure they have to live with the consequences of showing you exactly who they really are. Sometimes it's taking something they thought they deserved and giving it to people who will actually appreciate it. And sometimes it's knowing that the son who abandoned his mother on a dark road will spend the rest of his life explaining to people why she left him nothing but a $1,000 reminder of what his cruelty cost him.